Welcome to the third lesson in this module on an overview of the course and then how to set up Excel properly. In this lesson, I'm going to give you a tour of the Excel interface. This is not going to be very long or detailed or involving. I am really just introducing this to you, and this is more if you have not used Excel much before, or if you're new to it, or you've used only much older versions or something like that. Now, I'm recording this on Excel 2013. However, this interface is very similar in Excel 2007, 2010, and on the Mac Excel 2008 and 2011. So it's very similar, but some of the shortcut keys and a few other things will be different. We'll be getting to those in more detail later in the course. Now, if a new version of Excel comes out and makes this completely irrelevant, then we will either update this video or add a note below this indicating how things have changed or something of that nature. So it is unlikely that Microsoft at this stage is going to come in and completely change things around, because they did that last time and a lot of people got really annoyed at them. But it's possible, and things will certainly change, and at the very least there will be minor changes. So keep in mind that this is not really a perfect guideline to exactly what to expect. Instead, it's more just a general tour of what goes where and what the purpose of different items in Excel actually is. Let's start in the top, and the first thing we see all the way up in this area, which I'll circle with my screen recording software, these are essentially very shortcut keys, and what happens here is that when I press the Alt key and release it, you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 here. And so these are essentially very quick methods that we can use to access different things. So I have page break view and normal view here. We'll get to those in the lessons on printing and displaying, but we also have a couple other things like saving the file, redoing and undoing actions, and so on and so forth. So bottom line is that this area is really for these quick shortcuts that we're going to be using over and over again, and we'll actually get into how to create them in the last module in this course. Now if we go over here and click on this icon over here, this is just a standard Windows icon for moving, sizing, minimizing, maximizing, closing the window. Of course, all this is going to look different on the Mac interface, but the idea is pretty much the same. Now the next thing we see below this is what's known as the ribbon menu over here. So I'm going to circle all this so you see what I'm referring to. And this is really the main menu system that drives Excel. And how it works is you press the Alt key and then you see the letter for each of these different ribbon items. And then what happens is when you press that letter, so let's say I press N and release N right now. Now I move over to the Insert tab and I can insert various objects, shapes, graphs, hyperlinks, text, symbols, all sorts of other things. And again, this will look different depending on which version of Excel you're using. Also note that when you go in and insert something here, so let's say I just insert a column chart. Well, take a look at this. Now we get some new items appearing on this menu over here. So this menu actually changes depending on what you have selected within Excel and what you've just inserted, and so on and so forth. So keep in mind that it's here for a reason, but it can and does change as you go through and actually use Excel, especially when you insert objects such as graphs and charts and other things like that, and you have to go in and format and modify them. I'm just going to get rid of this for now. So bottom line is that you press the Alt key and you can access these. Now on the Mac, you cannot actually do that. Unfortunately, they have much more limited built-in shortcuts, so it doesn't work quite like that. Now in future versions, you may be able to do something similar to this, but as I record this anyway, a lot of these built-in shortcuts simply don't exist and you'll have to use workarounds instead. If you go to the File menu here, so if I press Alt, release it, and then I press F, you can see the usual options for opening file, saving as, sharing, exporting, closing. So pretty much standard, pretty standard overall with what you see in other Windows type programs. And again, this will look different if you're using Excel 2007, 2010, and presumably in versions after this one as well. Now within this ribbon menu, one of the most common ones that you're going to be using all the time is the Home ribbon over here. And what I want to show you on this one is that if we press Alt and then H, you have a whole lot of options for formatting things more quickly. So in the past, you used to have to go through a more complex process and you have to press Control 1 or Command 1 on the Mac. And that would bring up what's known as the Format Cells dialog box over here. But in newer versions of Excel, really anything 2007 and onward, you can just press Alt H and then have a lot of these options at your fingertips right here. So if I press Alt H FC, for example, I can select my font color. If I press Alt HH, I can select my fill color, the background color for these cells, and you can see how it changes in the top left corner. So there are a whole lot of other things here that make it much easier to apply this formatting. And what's nice is that Excel actually displays the letters that activate each shortcut key here. So throughout this course, we're going to be going through and you're going to be memorizing a lot of these shortcuts as you practice and get more practice. But actually, Excel makes it easier for you in these more recent versions by displaying these shortcut keys explicitly. So whenever you need to use them, you don't really have to think that much. You just press Alt H, and then you think about which shortcut key you want to use based on what pops up on screen. A few other things to note in this menu: if you press the little area all the way at the bottom here, font settings, Control Shift F, or for alignment settings, what this does is it basically jumps to the Format Cells menu, but it gives you more granular control. So it lets you actually set everything that appears, and it automatically selects the font tab in here. So this is really just a time-saving shortcut. In reality, I find myself actually just pressing Control 1 or Command 1 if I want to go in and do something like this, because if you think about the shortcuts here, Alt H F A and then Alt H F N and so on and so forth, Control 1 is actually faster, and really it's not that much quicker to go in and automatically have this selected. But those are a few things to note. Now, when we go below the ribbon menu here, we see a couple things on screen. So I'll go through both of these. Now, over here on the left side, we see this A1 cell, and then over here we have what's known as the formulas bar. What do both of these mean? Well, this one over here on the left, this is really just for showing us where we currently are in the spreadsheet. What I can do is, let's say I'm in cell N21 and I want to jump back to A1. Well, there's a keyboard shortcut for doing that, but if I didn't know it, I could just type A1 in this bar and then I would instantly jump back there. So this name box is what is called in Excel. It lets you just jump around to whatever cell you want. So if I want to jump to cell Z1011, well, look, here I am, 1011 for the row and then Z for the column. So not terribly practical in most cases, because in most cases in models you're not going to be jumping around like that, but it can be helpful sometimes depending on how you set things up. Now this formula bar over here, this is really for entering formulas. So I could try to enter a formula in a cell and just type here and just be looking at this, but it's much easier generally to go to this formula bar and then to enter it here. And you can say I have enter buttons, cancel buttons, and it just lets us see things a little bit more easily, and it automatically suggests formulas as I go in and enter them here. So really just something that helps you out. It makes it a little bit easier to see, because if you try to enter them within Excel and you're only focused on this part down here, what happens is that if you have a lot of data or a very crowded spreadsheet, it's harder to actually review what you're typing in, whereas if you focus more in this area, it's a little bit easier to see everything. So that's that. And then really the next thing I want to show you is just this whole area with all the rows and columns. Now, this is probably intuitive to you. If you've ever used a spreadsheet before, you know how it works. But essentially the letters here just stand for columns, and as we go over, we keep going over columns. In newer versions of Excel, you can get to very, very high numbers here. You can support millions and millions of cells, if not more than that. So bottom line is that there is a very high limit. There is a limit because you can't just have infinite cells going down or across, but as you can see, it's a very, very high number. And really the main thing to keep in mind here is that in Excel, you're always going to be using the letter first, so the column reference, and then the row reference with the letter. So if I go down, you can see how this is changing. I just press the equals key, and now it's going to cell E11 or G11, H11, and so on and so forth as you go down and across. So everything in Excel has that letter first for the column and then the number for the row. You could actually change that and change how you refer to cells and references in Excel, but I strongly recommend against doing that because pretty much everyone uses this method. Now, if you want some more real estate for this entire editing area, you can press Control F1, and that gets rid of the ribbon menu up there. So that can be helpful. I actually prefer to leave this enabled, and for teaching purposes in this lesson, I'm always going to leave this enabled so you can see where all the shortcuts are. Now, if you're a pro user and you really need the extra real estate on screen, you can certainly leave it disabled, especially if you know the keyboard shortcuts well. It's not really a huge deal. What happens if I do this, though, is if I press Alt-H now, well, now the ribbon menu reappears. So it is not even disabled really, it's really just hidden off screen for a little bit, and by pressing one of these menu keys, Alt-H or Alt-N or Alt-A, we can simply get this to appear once again. Now we'll be going into all these ribbon menu items in more detail in the upcoming lessons and upcoming modules, but that's the basic idea for now. I'm not going to go into these in too much depth here. I'm going to press Control F1 so I can restore this. And then as far as other things, that's really most of what I was going to go through in this lesson, but I'm going to now go and turn our attention to the bottom part of the screen. Now these scroll bars on the side, these work just like scroll bars in any other version of Windows, so there isn't too much to say about these. But if we turn our attention to the bottom part of the screen, a couple of things to point out here. First off, we see these arrows over here, which let us go and scroll to the first or last sheet. So if I had additional spreadsheets in this file, remember the way that a file works in Excel is that by default, in older versions it has 3 spreadsheets. In newer versions, you just start out with 1 spreadsheet like I have here. Now if I hit the plus button, which only exists in Excel 2013 and onward, so don't even look for this in older versions, but if I hit this and I insert some new sheets over here, what I can now do is go to the first or last sheets by just using the mouse over here, and for some reason these arrows are disabled, but what I can do is just cycle through those. We'll learn the keyboard shortcuts for all this later on, but that's the idea for now. And each of these sheets can represent a different part of your model or whatever type of file you're trying to create. So for example, if you're looking at data for customers of a company and sales reps, sales representatives for that company, Sheet 1 here might hold all the order data for all customers. Sheet 2 might hold the customer information. Sheet 3 might hold the sales rep information. And if you're creating a financial model, Sheet 1 might have the company's financial statements. Sheet 2 might have the assumptions. And then Sheet 3 might have something about their valuation, for example. So these are really just for dividing your file into more granular parts. And then a few last things to show you. One interesting feature here is this very bottom part, which is called the status bar. And what this does is it shows you essentially what Excel is currently doing. So right now it says ready. What happens if I start typing something? So if I press the equals key, now you can see it changes to enter down here. And what will happen is if I go in and I multiply 2 cells together, let's say, you can see it changes to point because it's telling me that it's in point mode now. It's going out and letting me select a cell to point to. I press enter, and it goes back to ready. It actually changed briefly to calculate, but it went away so quickly because it's such an easy calculation that we don't need to do anything there. This is useful because if you have an error or some kind of other problem, it'll also show up here. Now this is a blank file, so it can't even really introduce errors that easily, but if we did have something like that, it would show up down here. And then macros we'll get into later on, but if we had macros that were recording, this little part down here would also change. So those are a few things on this bottom bar, this taskbar, the status bar. And then going over here, so we have normal page layout, page break view, then we have the zoom in or zoom out percentage, which we can change like that. There are actually better ways to change this, which we'll go through in the lesson on specifically on zooming in and zooming out. But for now, that's one thing that you can do. It's actually better to use the mouse and hold down the control key and then scroll in or scroll out with the mouse wheel. But again, we'll get to all that in the lesson specifically on that topic. So that's a bit about the interface of Excel. There is really not too much to say here. I'm really just going over a few basic things that are going to come up over and over again. We've already been through quite a lot in the past lesson just before this one on how to set up Excel properly, and all that still applies here. The options menu, Alt-T-O, is still going to be very, very important, and it's going to come up all the time, but I didn't go through it because we covered it in the last lesson. So that's really about it for what I wanted to say here. Coming up next, we are going to be looking at the quick start guide for this course, and I'm going to be covering what you should go through and what you should focus on depending on how much experience you have with Excel and how much time you have to go through all the lessons and master the material here.